The cursor blinked like a heartbeat on a screen that suddenly felt hostile. Her coffee sat untouched, cooling beside a stack of reports with her name on them. Then the subject line appeared, clean and polite, as if it weren't a knife. Organizational changes, it said, and her throat tightened before she even clicked. In that second, the office lights seemed brighter, like they wanted to witness it. She read the first sentence twice because her brain refused to translate it. It thanked her for her dedication, as if years could be summarized in a bow. It said her role was being eliminated, like she was a chair being removed from a room. Her palms went slick, and she pressed them against her skirt to hide the tremble. Somewhere nearby, a printer hummed, indifferent to the sound of her life shifting. She glanced around, expecting someone to look up, to notice her face changing. A coworker laughed softly at a meme, and the sound felt almost cruel. 2 desks away, a manager spoke in calm tones about a deadline for next week. Next week, she thought, as if she was still part of that calendar. She realized with a sting that the world was not waiting for her to catch her breath. At 55, she had mastered every version of competence they asked for. She had learned to smile through meetings that stole her mornings and her patience. She had stayed late, not because she loved it, but because leaving felt like failing. Her badge had opened doors, and she had mistaken those doors for belonging. Now the badge felt heavy on its lanyard, like a weight she'd worn willingly. Her finger hovered over reply, desperate to correct a misunderstanding that didn't exist. She wanted to type a paragraph that would prove she was useful, essential, safe to keep. But the email wasn't a conversation. It was a verdict disguised as professionalism. She swallowed hard and tasted something metallic, like fear trying to become anger. In the glass of her monitor, she barely recognized the woman staring back. She stood up slowly, as if sudden movement might shatter her in public. The chair rolled back with a small squeak that sounded embarrassingly loud. She gathered her notebook, her pen, her phone, performing normality like a costume. When she reached for her badge, her hand hesitated, not ready to let it go. It wasn't plastic she was holding, it was the name she'd used for herself. On her way out, she passed the wall with framed awards and glossy company photos. Her own photo wasn't there, of course, because she'd never been the point. In the elevator, her reflection looked composed, but her eyes looked newly homeless. As the doors closed, she felt an ache that wasn't just loss, but exposure. And somewhere in that ache, a question began to form without permission. The sun hit her face the moment she stepped outside, bright and unfairly cheerful. Her shoes clicked on the pavement, and every step sounded like she was leaving a funeral. She unlocked her car with a beep that felt too loud for what had happened. When she sat behind the wheel, her hands stayed frozen at 10 and 2. For the first time in decades, she didn't know where she was supposed to go next. She looked back at the building, waiting for a sign, a person, a moment of acknowledgement. No one ran after her, no one called her name, no one asked if she was okay. Cars came and went, employees laughed, a delivery truck backed up with a soft alarm. Her absence had already been absorbed into the normal rhythm of the day. That realization landed in her chest like a stone that didn't intend to move. Her phone buzzed with a calendar reminder for a meeting she would never attend. Baft it sync, it said, like her life could still be synchronized with theirs. She swiped it away, and the screen went dark, reflecting her own stunned expression. A wave of heat rose behind her eyes, and she refused to let it spill yet. Crying in a parking lot felt like a headline she didn't want to become. She thought about the paycheck. Yes, the rent. Yes, the insurance. Yes, but underneath those practical fears lived something sharper, something she couldn't name. It was the terror of being unassigned, of not having a place to report to. She had confused responsibility with identity, so completely it felt like the same word. Now she was a sentence without a subject, floating in the quiet air. She started the engine, then turned it off, then started it again, like a ritual. The radio came on automatically, a morning host joking about traffic on the 101. Traffic, she thought, as if she still belonged to the commuting world of purpose. She turned the volume down, until the voice became a distant murmur. Silence returned, and in it she could hear her own breathing, uneven and small. Her mind tried bargaining, offering every sacrifice she'd made, like evidence in court. All those birthdays missed, all those dinners eaten from a plastic container at her desk, all those weekends she gave away, telling herself it was temporary, just this quarter. She had given them time the way people give love, hoping it would be returned. And now the return was an email with a signature block and no warmth. She gripped the steering wheel until her knuckles whitened, then forced her fingers to relax. A strange thought slipped in, not comforting, but honest in a way she couldn't ignore. If no one noticed her leaving, then maybe she had been living as a shadow. The idea terrified her, because it suggested she had been invisible long before today. And as she pulled out of the parking lot, she wondered who she would be at home. The front door opened to the familiar scent of lemon cleaner and quiet routines. She stepped inside like a guest, unsure of the rules in her own hallway. The clock in the kitchen ticked loudly, as if it had been waiting to speak. Midday light fell across the counter, and everything looked too still, too perfect. She realized she rarely saw her home like this, awake and unoccupied. She set her purse down, then picked it up again, unable to commit to a place. Her keys clinked softly, a small sound that made her flinch for reasons she didn't understand. The refrigerator hummed, steady and loyal, unlike the world she had just left. She stared at a magnet from a beach trip 10 years ago, smiling faces frozen in time. Back then she had promised herself she would slow down, and then she never did. She walked into the living room and noticed the couch cushions were slightly uneven. It was a trivial detail, but it hit her like proof that life kept happening without her attention. On the bookshelf sat business books she'd bought to become better at becoming acceptable. Beside them, a dusty sketchpad from her 40s hid like a secret she once denied. She ran a finger along its edge and felt dust cling to her skin, like years. In the bathroom, she leaned over the sink and studied her face under harsh light. Fine lines mapped her smile, but today the smile felt like a story she couldn't repeat. She whispered her name to herself, testing how it sounded without a title attached. The name was real, but it felt unfinished, like it wanted more than survival. She turned the faucet on just to hear water, as if sound could anchor her. She tried to make tea, to perform calm, to pretend this was a day off. The kettle took too long, and impatience rose in her like a reflex from years of urgency. Every minute at work had been accounted for, measured, justified, defended. Here, time spread out like an ocean, and she didn't know how to swim in it. She felt the frightening freedom of unstructured hours, and it made her dizzy. When the tea finally steeped, she carried the mug to the window and looked out. A neighbor walked a dog, chatting on the phone, living a life that seemed effortlessly human. She wondered when she had started living like a machine built to earn approval. Her chest tightened, not with grief alone, but with a sense of betrayal toward herself. She had kept waiting for permission to be more than productive, and no one had given it. As the afternoon light shifted, she noticed something else, subtle but impossible to ignore. Without the job, the house didn't feel like a sanctuary. It felt like a mirror. It reflected choices she had made, and also choices she had avoided making. She realized the real loss wasn't the office, but the story she told to endure it. And deep in that realization, another question began to press, quieter but more dangerous. She went to the grocery store because she needed an excuse to be among people. The automatic doors opened, and cool air rushed over her arms like a reset button. She took a cart and moved slowly, watching shoppers who looked busy in casual ways. A mother negotiated cereal with a child. A cashier hummed along to a song she didn't know. No one cared why she was there at 2 in the afternoon, and that felt unsettling. In the produce aisle, she caught her reflection in the glass door of a freezer. She looked like any other woman, and yet she felt like she had been erased. At work, someone always needed her, questioned her, depended on her for something. Here, she could vanish between the oranges and the lettuce without leaving a ripple. Her throat tightened as she imagined the world continuing smoothly without ever noticing her absence. She reached for a bag of apples and remembered how she used to skip lunch meetings. She remembered the pride she felt when people said, "We couldn't do this without you." She remembered believing that sentence was love, and that love was security. Now the sentence echoed differently, like a trick she'd been grateful to hear. If they couldn't do it without her, why had they done it so easily today? At the checkout, the cashier asked, "How's your day going?" in a practiced tone. She almost said, "I lost my job," just to see if the words made her real. Instead, she smiled automatically and said, "Oh, just running errands." The cashier nodded, scanned her items, and the moment passed without weight. The normalcy felt like a slap, because her world had cracked and no one could see it. Outside, the California sun was warm, and the parking lot shimmered with heat. She loaded groceries into the trunk, feeling absurdly capable at a task so small. This, she thought, is what my life looks like to strangers now. A woman with bags, no badge, no title, no shorthand explanation for why she matters. The fear wasn't just financial, it was existential, like she was fading at the edges. She drove along familiar streets and noticed how businesses changed without asking her permission. New coffee shops, new signs, new people and new jobs, all of it replacing what used to be hit her that the city had always been changing, even while she stood still in her routine. She had believed stability was a fortress, but it was really just a pause in motion. And now motion had returned, fast and indifferent, and she felt left behind by her own life. When she parked back at home, she sat in the car and didn't get out right away. She listened to the ticking of the engine cooling, small sounds that felt intimate. She pictured herself 10 years from now, and a cold emptiness rushed through her. Would anyone remember her work, her effort, her late nights, her sacrifices, her name? The question didn't ask for comfort. It demanded an answer she didn't yet have. That evening, she opened a drawer looking for a bill and found an old notebook instead. The cover was bent, the pages swollen slightly from time and neglect. Inside were lists written in her younger handwriting, dreams disguised as plans. Take a ceramics class, one line said, and her heart lurched at the simplicity. She had wanted things once, before wanting security became her only language. She sat at the kitchen table and flipped through page after page of postponed life. There were travel ideas, a Huffington story, sketches of a garden she never planted. Each page felt like a small witness, quietly accusing but also quietly faithful. She could almost hear her younger self asking, "When are we going to start?" Her throat tightened because she had no good answer, only the habit of delay. She remembered telling herself she'd do those things after the next promotion, after the mortgage felt lighter, after the quarter ended, after her team stabilized, after, a word that sounded responsible until it started sounding like surrender. She had been so proud of being dependable that she stopped being deliberate. Now, with the job gone, after had collapsed, leaving her face to face with now, the next morning, she tried to return to old instincts and opened her laptop to job sites. Her fingers typed titles that looked like costumes she'd worn too long. The descriptions promised fast-paced environments and high resilience, like pain was a perk. She stared at the requirements and felt something in her stomach turn, not fear, but refusal. It was small, almost imperceptible, but it felt like the first honest sensation in months. She closed the laptop and immediately felt guilty, as if she had committed a crime. Guilt had been her fuel for years, pushing her back into motion whenever she paused. But sitting there, she realized the guilt wasn't about money. It was about identity. If she wasn't striving, who was she, and what would she say when people asked? The question made her pulse race, because it exposed how much she needed the label. That afternoon, she opened the dusty sketch pad and held a pencil like it was unfamiliar. The graphite smelled faintly of wood and possibility, a quiet scent that made her eyes sting. For a few minutes, she forgot to perform usefulness, and she simply existed. The relief scared her, because it felt like stepping off a cliff into open air. Later, as the sky softened into dusk, she stared at her hands resting on the table. They had built presentations, managed crises, soothed egos, carried groceries, wiped tears in private. They were not the hands of a job title, she realized. They were the hands of a person. The thought didn't solve anything yet, but it loosened something tight in her chest. And in that looseness, a new hunger rose, one she could no longer ignore. She woke before sunrise out of sheer habit, like her body still owed someone a schedule. The house was dark, and the silence felt like a blank page she didn't know how to fill. She made coffee and opened her laptop, the screen casting a cold glow on her hands. Job boards loaded with bright promises and small print that sounded like a warning. She told herself she just needed to get back in, to restore the old shape of life. Her resume looked impressive in the way a mask can look convincing. Years of leadership, metrics, projects delivered, problems solved before they became visible. She read the bullet points and felt strangely detached, like she was describing a stranger. Still, she clicked apply, and each submission felt like dropping a message into the ocean. The quiet that followed every click was louder than any rejection letter. At a cafe near the coast, she tried to network with former colleagues over iced lattes. They smiled warmly, asked polite questions, and kept their eyes moving like they were scanning exits. Someone said, "It's tough out there," with a sympathetic tilt of the head. Someone else promised to keep an ear out, a phrase that sounded like a courtesy, not a plan. She nodded, thanked them, and felt herself shrinking into a version that asked for scraps. Driving home, she caught herself rehearsing explanations for her unemployment, like a confession. She imagined interviews where she would sell herself with the same polished desperation as before. But under the rehearsal ran a new current, uncomfortable and persistent. A small part of her didn't want to go back. Not to the pace, not to the pretending. That part scared her, because it sounded like rebellion, and she had always been obedient. Days blurred into a routine of applying, waiting, refreshing email, then applying again. Some companies sent automated responses that arrived before she could even hope. "Thank you for your interest," they said. Like interest was all she had left. She began to dread the sound of new notifications because they rarely meant a human had seen her. With every silence, she felt her old identity cracking, and the cracks kept spreading. One afternoon, her printer jammed while she tried to print yet another cover letter. She yanked the paper free too hard, and it tore down the middle with a harsh rip. The sound startled her, and then something inside her snapped in the same direction. She stared at the torn page and suddenly hated the careful words she had written. They sounded like she was begging to be chosen by people who didn't know her at all. That night, she lay in bed listening to the distant rush of traffic on the freeway. Headlights swept across the ceiling like passing thoughts that wouldn't stay. She realized she wasn't just afraid of failing to find a job, she was afraid of succeeding and stepping back into the same cage with a different name. And in the darkness, she felt a truth rising that she had spent years keeping down. She went to a small community center in her neighborhood because the flyer promised career support. The room smelled like old carpet and peppermint tea, and folding chairs formed a lopsided circle. Most of the faces were younger, restless with impatience, but a few carried quiet exhaustion. She sat near the back, hoping to disappear while still being helped. It was the kind of compromise she'd mastered, present, but not exposed. A facilitator introduced herself with easy warmth and asked everyone to share one sentence. When it was her turn, she felt her mouth go dry like she'd been called to the front of a class. "I was laid off," she said, and the word laid sounded too gentle for the fall she'd felt. "I'm trying to figure out what's next," she added, careful to keep emotion behind her teeth. The group nodded, and for once the nods didn't feel like pity, but recognition. After the session, an older woman approached her with silver hair and sharp, kind eyes. She introduced herself as Denise and offered a paper cup of tea like it was a small rescue. They sat by a bulletin board covered with classes and volunteer postings, bright with possibility. Denise asked, "What did you love before you became good at being needed?" The question landed so precisely it made her laugh once, short and surprised, like a cough. She opened her mouth to answer and realized she didn't know, not because there had been nothing, but because she had buried it under decades of responsibility. Her mind offered corporate words: impact, deliverables, strategy, and she felt embarrassed by them. Denise watched her struggle and said softly, "You're allowed to be a person, you know." The simplicity of that sentence made her eyes sting, as if they had been waiting for permission. She confessed, quietly, how she'd built her identity around being reliable and productive, how she'd been praised for it, promoted for it, rewarded for it, trapped by it. Denise listened without interrupting, the way people do when they're not trying to fix you. Then Denise said, "A job is a role, not a soul," like she'd said it many times before. Hearing it out loud made something shift, as if a lock inside her finally turned. Denise told her about reinventing herself after a divorce at 52, how she'd started small, volunteering, taking classes, letting curiosity lead before confidence arrived. She didn't romanticize it. She admitted she'd been scared, broke, and angry. But she also said, "I stopped asking who would hire me and started asking who I wanted to become." That sentence followed her like a song she couldn't stop hearing, even after she left. In the car, she sat with her hands on the steering wheel and replayed the question, "What did you love before you became good at being needed?" She pictured her younger self with paint on her fingers, laughing at a mess she'd made on purpose. She felt grief for the years she'd spent proving her worth instead of exploring it. And for the first time, the future didn't feel like a closed door, but an unopened one. The next morning, she opened the closet in the hallway and searched like she was looking for evidence. Behind a stack of old files and a box of holiday decorations, she found it. A small ceramic bowl she'd made in a long-ago class. imperfect and proud in its uneven rim. When she lifted it, dust floated in the sunlight like tiny ghosts of her own postponement. She held the bowl to her chest, and her breathing slowed as if it recognized something familiar. She drove to a local art supply store because the impulse felt urgent and fragile. The store smelled of paper, wood, and paint, an honest smell, not curated for profit. She wandered the aisles, touching brushes and sketchbooks like she was relearning how to have hands. A young employee asked if she needed help, and she almost said, "I need my life back." Instead, she said, "I'm starting again," and the words sounded both terrifying and true. At home, she cleared a corner of the dining table, as if she were making space for someone important. She laid down newspaper, set out pencils, and opened a fresh sketchbook with careful reverence. The first page looked too clean, like it could judge her for being rusty. Her hand trembled when she made the first mark, and she hated how uncertain it looked. Then she took a breath and made another line, and another, letting the mess be part of the return. She drew a simple thing, at first an orange from the fruit bowl, a mug, her own fingertips. The shapes were clumsy, but the act of looking closely felt like waking up. She noticed light in a way she hadn't noticed it in years, the way it softened at the edges. The pencil scratched gently, and the sound was strangely comforting, like a quiet conversation. For 20 minutes, she didn't think about applications, layoffs, or age, only shadow and curve. When she stopped, she expected shame, but what she felt was relief with a sharp edge. It reminded her that she still had an inner life, not just a professional one. That realization came with grief too, because it proved how long she'd neglected herself. She sat back and stared at the page, and her eyes filled without drama, just truth. She wiped the tears with the side of her hand, smudging graphite, and didn't mind the smear. Later, she searched online for a local ceramics studio, her heart beating like it was doing something risky. The class schedule was full of strangers' names and time slots, ordinary and brave. Her finger hovered over register, and the old voice returned, sharp and familiar. "You're too old," it said. "You'll be the awkward one. You'll waste money. You'll fail." She pressed register anyway, and the click sounded like a small door opening. That night, she washed her hands and noticed faint graphite on her skin. She held her fingers under warm water and watched the dark lines fade, leaving her palms clean again. But something else didn't fade: the feeling of being connected to herself, however briefly. In bed, she stared at the ceiling and imagined wet clay, spinning, centered under her touch. And she realized she wasn't just returning to art, she was returning to the woman she left behind. The studio was tucked between a yoga place and a florist, both smelling like new beginnings. Inside, the air was warm and damp, thick with the earthy scent of clay and kill heat. Shelves held bowls and cups made by hands that weren't trying to impress anyone, only to express. She signed in with her name and felt strange writing it without adding a job title after it. Her stomach fluttered as if she were about to perform, but no one was asking her to be perfect. The instructor showed her how to wedge the clay, pressing and folding until it became smooth. The motion felt physical in a way her old work never did, honest and immediate. Her palms grew coated in slip, cool and silky, and she found herself smiling without planning to. At the wheel, the clay sat like a small planet, waiting for her to decide what it would become. She placed her hands around it and felt the hum of the spinning surface travel up her arms. "Center it," the instructor said, and the words sounded like advice for a life, not just pottery. She leaned in, applied pressure, and the clay resisted at first, wobbling with stubbornness. She adjusted her grip and tried again, breath steady, shoulders relaxed, attention full. Slowly, the wobble softened, and the clay surrendered into a calm, balanced rotation. Her eyes stung with an emotion she didn't expect, as if she had just centered herself to. When she pulled the walls up, the form rose unevenly, thin in one spot, thick in another. The old perfectionism lunged forward, ready to scold her for not mastering it immediately, but the instructor shrugged and said, "That's part of it. You learn by collapsing a few." Collapsing a few, she repeated in her mind, tasting the freedom in those words. At work, collapsing anything had been punished. Here, it was simply part of becoming. She made a small bowl that day, imperfect, leaning slightly to the left, like it had its own opinion. She looked at it and felt affection, not embarrassment, as if it were a brave little attempt. No one asked for a business case. No one demanded she justify the time. No one graded her value. She realized she had spent years waiting for permission to make something just because it mattered to her. Now she was making something because she was alive, and that felt like a radical act. On the drive home, her hands smelled faintly of clay, even after she scrubbed them. At red lights, she lifted her fingers to her nose, inhaling the earthiness like a secret. She imagined a small shelf in her house filled with objects she made, tangible proof of her own presence. Not awards with a company logo, but pieces shaped by her choices, her patience, her touch. The thought made her chest feel wider, as if the air inside her finally had room. That evening, she posted a photo of her messy, leaning bowl in a small online community group. Her caption was simple: "First day back at the wheel after years away." Within minutes, strangers left comments, gentle encouragement, shared stories, small hearts, and warm words. She stared at the screen, stunned by how seen she felt by people who owed her nothing. And in that feeling, she sensed a new kind of identity, forming quiet, personal, and hers. The next week, a rejection email arrived while she was eating breakfast. It was brief, automated, and efficient, like a door closing without even turning its head. Her stomach dropped, and the old urgency snapped back into place like a familiar collar. She looked at the calendar and saw the ceramics class circled, and suddenly it felt indulgent. The critical voice arrived right on time, sharp as a blade and twice as loud. It told her she was being irresponsible, childish, delusional, selfish. It said art wouldn't pay the bills, and at her age, she should focus on reality. It reminded her of retirement accounts and health insurance, and the way employers preferred younger faces. It used a language of fear, because fear had always convinced her to obey. She sat there frozen, coffee cooling again, the same way it had on the day of the layoff. She opened her laptop and searched for stable jobs like she was searching for air. The listings looked like a parade of the same life in different costumes. Each description demanded endless energy, endless adaptability, endless enthusiasm for someone else's goals. Her chest tightened, and she felt the same metallic taste of panic rise behind her tongue. But beneath the panic was something new, a quiet resistance that refused to disappear. She tried to talk herself out of the studio class, telling herself she could go later. Later was her oldest lie, polished and convincing, the lie that had stolen decades. She stared at her hands and remembered the clay spinning smoothly under her steady pressure. She remembered how her shoulders had dropped, how her breathing had deepened, how her mind had softened. The memory felt like a small lantern, and she didn't want to blow it out. Still, the pressure mounted when bills arrived, when friends asked, "Any leads yet?" She smiled and said, "I'm working on it," while her insides felt like a storm behind glass. At night, she lay awake, calculating numbers, imagining worst-case scenarios with cruel precision. Fear built a courtroom in her head and put her on trial for daring to want a different life. The verdict always sounded the same: get back in line, get back to proving yourself. On Friday, she stood in her kitchen with her car keys in her hand, debating. The studio was across town, and traffic would be bad, and she could use the time to apply for more jobs. The practical argument felt responsible, and responsibility had always won. But then she looked at the crooked bowl drying on her counter, and something tender rose in her. She whispered, "I made you," and the softness of that sentence cracked the hardness in her chest. She went to class anyway, not because she felt brave, but because she refused to abandon herself again. When her hands sank into the clay, the critical voice didn't vanish, but it grew quieter, farther away. She centered the lump, steady and patient, and felt her own pulse settle into a calmer rhythm. This wasn't a solution yet, she knew, but it was a direction, a choice toward life instead of fear. And as the wheel spun, she realized the real battle wasn't the job market, it was the story she believed. The flyer sat on her kitchen counter for 3 days before she touched it again. Community Art Night, it said, handwritten letters, imperfect and inviting. The ceramics studio was hosting a small open event, and students could display one piece. Her crooked bowl rested nearby, still slightly uneven, still undeniably hers. The idea of showing it made her stomach tighten in a way that felt almost physical. She told herself it didn't matter, that no one would care, that it was optional. Optional things had always been the first to disappear when life demanded seriousness. But something inside her resisted the familiar retreat, tired of always choosing safety. She wrapped the bowl in a towel with careful hands, as if it were fragile confidence. Driving there, she kept rehearsing reasons she could turn around and go home. The studio buzzed with quiet energy, voices layered with laughter and soft music. Tables held mugs, plates, vases, each one different, each one imperfect in its own way. She placed her bowl down and immediately wanted to apologize for it. Instead, she stepped back and forced herself to simply stand there, breathing. No one laughed, no one pointed, no one questioned why she was there. A woman stopped in front of the bowl and tilted her head thoughtfully. "I like this one," she said, tracing the air near its edge without touching it. "It feels honest," the woman added, as if naming something more than shape. The word honest landed deeply, vibrating somewhere behind her ribs. She swallowed hard, surprised by how much she needed to hear that. Another person asked if she had made it, and she nodded, unsure of the right tone. "Yes," she said, the words small but steady, like a step on new ground. No resume followed, no explanation of her past, no justification for her presence. Just that single fact: she had made something, and it existed. For the first time since the layoff, she felt visible in a way that didn't cost her dignity. As the night unfolded, conversations drifted easily, without hierarchy or competition. People talked about process, mistakes, learning curves, joy in small discoveries. She realized no one here was trying to impress a system, only to express themselves. The simplicity of it felt radical, almost rebellious, against the life she had lived before. She laughed more than she expected, a sound that surprised her with its lightness. Driving home, the bowl sat safely on the passenger seat like a quiet companion. She didn't feel triumphant or transformed, but something had shifted undeniably. She had stepped into the world as herself, not as a title or a request. The fear hadn't disappeared, but it no longer felt like a command, and she sensed this was only the first of many steps she had postponed too long. The next morning, she woke with a strange calm that didn't depend on plans. Sunlight filtered through the curtains, soft and unhurried, touching her face gently. For once, she didn't reach for her phone to measure her worth in notifications. She lay still and noticed her breath, slow and present, like it belonged to her again. It occurred to her that peace wasn't something she earned, but something she allowed. She sat at the table with her old notebook open beside her coffee. This time, she didn't read the lists with shame or regret. She read them like messages from someone who had trusted her future self. Instead of asking why she had waited, she asked what was still possible now. The shift felt subtle, but it softened something that had been rigid for years. She thought about her career and saw it more clearly, without resentment. She had learned discipline, patience, leadership, resilience under pressure. Those years hadn't been a mistake. They had simply been incomplete. She realized value didn't vanish when a job ended, it changed shape. That understanding settled in her chest, like a truth she could finally rest on. Later, she updated her resume, but not with the old desperation. She wrote it as a record, not a plea, a chapter instead of a definition. For the first time, she didn't feel the urge to exaggerate or apologize. She saw her experience as something she carried, not something she clung to. The difference was quiet, but it changed the way her shoulders sat. She also started writing something else, just for herself. Pages filled with thoughts about fear, aging, creativity, and the relief of honesty. No one would read it, and that made the words come out cleaner. She noticed how much she had silenced herself to stay employable. Giving herself a private voice felt like reclaiming stolen ground. When friends asked how things were going, she answered more truthfully. "I'm figuring out who I am without the job," she said, and let the silence sit. Some looked confused, some curious, some quietly envious. She didn't rush to reassure them or herself anymore. The answer felt unfinished, but it also felt alive. That night, she stood in the kitchen and looked at her hands again. They were steady, capable, marked by time and use and choice. She understood then that worth wasn't assigned by an organization. It was inherent, persistent, waiting patiently beneath every role she'd played. And for the first time, she believed that truth without needing proof. A month passed, then another, and the urgency softened into intention. She still applied for work, but now she chose carefully, deliberately. She declined interviews that felt like traps disguised as opportunity. Each no was frightening, but it also felt like a muscle strengthening. She was learning that choice was a form of power she had forgotten. She began selling a few pieces through the studio, modest and unremarkable by market standards. The money barely covered supplies, but that wasn't what stayed with her. What mattered was seeing someone hold her work and smile quietly. It felt like a conversation that didn't require explanation or credentials. She realized success didn't have to be loud to be real. She adjusted her spending, simplified her life, and discovered she needed less than she thought. Without the constant performance of importance, many things lost their grip on her. She cooked more, walked more, listened more, hurried less. The rhythm of her days changed from extraction to presence. It wasn't glamorous, but it was deeply sane. One afternoon, she received an offer for a consulting role, part-time and flexible. The work respected her experience without demanding her soul. She negotiated calmly, surprised by her own steadiness. When she accepted, it felt like collaboration, not surrender. She smiled, realizing this was alignment, not retreat. She no longer introduced herself with a single defining sentence. Sometimes she said, "I make ceramics." Sometimes, "I consult." Sometimes, nothing at all. Each version felt equally true, equally incomplete, equally acceptable. She had stopped trying to be legible at a glance. Her life was richer for being harder to summarize. She thought about success and noticed how her definition had shrunk and deepened. It was no longer about climbing or proving or outlasting others. It was about coherence, her days matching her values more often than not. It was about ending the day without feeling like she'd abandoned herself. That metric felt radical, and she trusted it more than numbers. Standing at her wheel one evening, clay spinning steadily under her hands, she smiled softly. Success, she realized, was waking up without dread. It was choosing how to spend her attention. It was building a life that didn't require her disappearance, and in that understanding, she felt quietly victorious. Fear still visited her, but it no longer ruled the house. It arrived like weather now, temporary and observable. She learned to listen without obeying, to pause instead of panic. Each time she chose herself, the fear lost a little authority. Resilience, she discovered, was not loud, it was consistent. She attended the studio regularly, becoming a familiar presence. New students asked her questions, and she answered without pretending expertise. She shared mistakes freely, which made others braver about their own. Teaching wasn't something she planned, but it emerged naturally. She recognized leadership in herself again, this time without exhaustion. At 56, she noticed her body differently, with respect instead of resentment. Aches came, but so did strength, patience, and a deeper sense of timing. She no longer chased youth, she honored experience. Aging stopped feeling like decline and started feeling like refinement. She stood taller, not to impress, but because she felt grounded. She reconnected with friends she had neglected during her busiest years. Conversations deepened when she stopped performing success. They spoke about fear, reinvention, and the strange courage of starting over. She realized her story wasn't isolated. It was shared quietly everywhere. That understanding replaced loneliness with connection. Sometimes she returned to the old office area for errands or meetings. The building looked smaller now, less imposing. She felt no bitterness, only a distant familiarity, like a former language. She thanked that chapter silently for what it had taught her. Then she left without looking back, lighter than before. At night, she reflected on how close she had come to disappearing into habit. The layoff, once a wound, now felt like an incision that had saved her life. Painful, precise, and necessary for something healthier to emerge. She didn't romanticize it, but she honored it. Growth, she understood, often arrives disguised as loss. She wasn't fearless, but she was present. She wasn't certain, but she was engaged. She hadn't won a battle. She had changed the terms entirely. Standing in her kitchen, hands dusted with clay, she felt whole. Not because everything was solved, but because she had stayed. One morning, she opened her eyes and felt something unfamiliar but welcome. Gratitude, quiet and unforced, settled in before thought. She didn't rush to label the day or predict its outcome. She simply noticed that she belonged to herself. That realization felt like a foundation no one could remove. She expanded her creative work slowly, intentionally, not chasing growth, but nurturing sustainability. She set boundaries where there had once been guilt. She said yes when it aligned, no when it didn't. Each decision reinforced the life she was building deliberately. She began mentoring women navigating similar crossroads, not with answers, but with presence and permission. She told them the truth, that fear doesn't vanish, but meaning can outweigh it. That starting over isn't a failure, it's an awakening. Watching their relief mirrored back to her felt profoundly full circle. Looking back, She no longer measured her life by continuity. She measured it by authenticity, by moments she showed up fully. The job had been a chapter, not the book. Losing it hadn't erased her, it had revealed her. That distinction changed everything. In the evenings, she often sat quietly with a finished piece in her hands. The weight of it grounded her, tangible and real. No one could downsize it, automate it, or take it away. It existed because she existed. That truth felt stronger than any contract she had ever signed. She thought about identity and smiled at how fluid it had become. She was not one thing, and she no longer needed to be. Her worth moved with her, not behind her like a shadow. She carried it forward, integrated and alive. For the first time, her future felt like a collaboration with herself. The story of her life didn't end with loss. It opened with choice, not the loud kind, but the daily kind, repeated with care. She had built something that could not be taken, because it lived inside her, a sense of purpose rooted in truth, not approval. And as she stepped into tomorrow, she knew she had finally come home.